Welcome back. You're watching our news review where I'm joined by Suzi Boniface and Mark Wallace. We'll hear from both of them in just a moment. But first, the long-running public inquiry into what has been called the worst treatment disaster in NHS history has ended almost 5 years after it began. Tens of thousands of patients were infected with HIV and hepatitis C through contaminated blood products imported from the US during the 1970s and 80s. Sky's Sadia Chowdhury reports.
The birth of her first child, but Michelle didn't know at the time that in just a few days, doctors would give her infected blood, leaving a deadly virus swimming inside of her.
I didn't know then, at that time, at the age of 22, that I'd been given a death sentence for committing no crimes, because at the end of 2015, I found out by chance that, in fact, the blood that was there to save my life contained hepatitis C.
Michelle's fight isn't over, even if the inquiry into the infected blood scandal is.
It is described as the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. Thousands of people were infected with HIV and hepatitis C. Many died, 500 of them since the start of this inquiry.
Among the dead, 74 schoolmates of Richard Warwick, infected when the boarding school they attended ran experimental treatment on students without informed consent.
It was just devastating. And the fact that the college was used to run trials on the boys using different types of medication, they were effectively purposefully infected.
Evidence has been heard for 4.5 years, sometimes from prominent politicians. But many key witnesses have been missing, either died or too unwell to attend an inquiry taking place decades after the event.
I have written to the Paymaster General to inform him of my intention to make a further interim report about the framework for compensation. I anticipate that I'll be in a position to do so before Easter, if not earlier.
For long-time campaigners like Colette, this pressure on the government is key.
For many, this has been cathartic. For me, it is a relief to have got to the point now where all that evidence and the allegations that we presented to the police, to the government, to the doctors, the politicians, has been heard at this inquiry. And I hope from that Sir Brian can only reach one possible conclusion.
The chairman's report is due to be published in the autumn. Sadia Chowdhury, Sky News, at the infected blood inquiry in London.
Let's get the reports of Suzi and Mark once again. And Suzi, described as the worst treatment disaster in NHS history. It's been a long time coming, this inquiry, 5 years.
It has, and as a journalist, I should be ashamed to say this. I went for one day of that inquiry because a contact of mine told me that Andy Burnham was going to be giving evidence there and mentioning the nuclear test veterans that I write about for the Daily Mirror. So I went along for a day, and I was really horrified to hear about, he was giving evidence about how he was misled by civil servants, perhaps intentionally as part of a cover-up, in order to not cover up what happened, but to cover up the mistakes that were made. And there was an awful lot that he said in his evidence that was very, very similar to what's happened to the nuclear test veterans, and which has also befallen the Grenfell families and the Hillsborough families, about the way institutions deal with these problems. And he was, I think, one of the only people who gave evidence who actually got a standing ovation from the victims of the scandal who were there witnessing it. And they've been going every single day for years. And some of them, as we've heard, have died while waiting for justice from this. They've already had some orders for interim compensation, but the government hasn't been terribly quick about organising that. And I do think that the journalists who are just managing now to say, well, it's over at last, I think we should all have maintained interest a bit longer during it and dipped in and out of that inquiry for more of the 5 years than I think that journalism generally has managed to do it. I mean, that inquiry came about because of the hard work of families and journalists that exposed things. But I think we should really all have been there and been paying attention for a lot more of it. And I suspect when the report comes out, there'll be people going through it with a fine tooth comb. But unfortunately, there's a lot of journalism, we pick things up, we become an expert in it for 10 seconds and then we drop it and move on to the next thing. And the issues that are being raised by the contaminated blood scandal, frankly, are issues that should affect and worry every single one of us in this country, whether you're a haemophiliac or not, because it affects how the institutions deal with a problem and something that's gone wrong. And they circle the wagons and they don't fix it. And that's the fundamental problem here. And in this instance, people have died as a result.
Yes, well, 500 have died since the start of the inquiry. But Mark, do you think lessons have been learnt? Because, I mean, that's the purpose of an inquiry, isn't it?
Well, that's one of the purposes of an inquiry. It's also to give, as one of your interviewees said, there's a degree of catharsis and justice and transparency to people so horrendously affected by issues like this. It's about leading some accountability and also, rightly compensating people where they've been so badly let down. But it must lead to some lessons being learned. Unfortunately, one of the things we've talked about quite a lot during a number of stories in this evening's press preview here have been the risks of groupthink, and then the negative, often hypersensitive way in which institutions react to whistleblowing, to criticism, to embarrassment, and those things lie to some degree in part of human nature. They lie in when cultures in organisations go wrong, and they're the kind of thing that you can only really fix by working really hard over a long period of time on culture and getting organisational structures set up right. It's really, really easy, much more easy for institutions to unlearn these lessons, to forget them or to willfully disregard them. It's very easy to kind of applaud them when it's someone else's institution that's being exposed. But when it happens, when something nasty lands on your own desk, it's very easy for a lot of institutions to say, oh my gosh, how do we put a lid on this? How do we push it under a carpet? How do we shut people up? And that happens way too often. And unfortunately, that's something, it's good that we are a nation in which this inquiry is taking place now. It would be better to be in a nation in which it took place 30 years ago. It would certainly be even better than that to be in a nation in which it didn't take 5 years after the start of the inquiry, but to get this point with the death of what's estimated to be hundreds or potentially thousands of people affected during the course of the inquiry itself. And those are things which I don't think anybody can really feel very positive about.
Indeed. Mark and Sophie, thank you very much for why did I call you Sophie? I know that you're Suzi Boniface, the one and only. Stay with us. Coming up, we'll have a full run through of tomorrow's front pages and discuss more of the day's news.